My sister stopped speaking to me for real after I asked if Annakinzel was the name of a tech startup. I wish I could say that was an exaggeration, or that it lasted a day, or that somebody brought out dessert and the whole thing blew over before the plates were cleared. My sister Maren was 7 months pregnant when she announced that name at my parents' dining room table, and by the time her daughter was actually born, she had turned one careless question from me into proof that I had spent years trying to ruin her life. The baby is named Clara now. Maren and I are barely close anymore. Those two facts are connected, but not in the way most of my family thinks they are. The night it started, I was sitting at that table with a bowl of mashed potatoes in front of me, a paper napkin stuck to my elbow, and my mom's pot roast steaming, because Maren had said she was craving it. My dad had opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for something. Maren's boyfriend, Ethan, kept smiling at her like he already knew something the rest of us didn't. She stood up halfway through dinner with one hand on the back of her chair and the other resting on her stomach. And she looked happier than I'd seen her look in months, not just excited but almost triumphant, and she announced that she and Ethan had finally picked a name. My mom set her fork down immediately. My dad leaned forward. My brother Noah pulled out his phone, which I assumed was so he could film Mom crying, or Maren crying, or both. I actually felt relieved for her in that moment, because Maren had spent the entire pregnancy rejecting names for every reason imaginable. Too plain, too popular, too old-fashioned, too close to a girl who'd been mean to her in 7th grade. She'd rejected one name because it was in the top 100 baby names that year and rejected another because it wasn't. She once loved a name for almost 2 weeks until she saw it printed on a personalized Easter basket online and decided the basket had cheapened it. So when she said, "Her name is Annakinzel," I honestly wasn't ready for what came out of my own mouth next. I asked, before my brain caught up with it, whether that was a tech startup. I didn't say it loudly and I didn't laugh, but Noah made a sound like he'd inhaled water. My mom covered her mouth, and my dad stared down at his plate so he wouldn't smile. Maren's whole face changed. She said, "Excuse me," and I told her I'd thought she'd said something closer to Annakin, and she said yes, that was exactly it, Annakin and Rapunzel put together into Annakinzel. Because Anakin from Star Wars had always been her favorite character since he was complicated and misunderstood, and Rapunzel was her favorite princess because she'd escaped a life other people had planned for her. And their daughter would have a name nobody else had, something romantic with an actual story behind it. Noah, who has never once in his life known when to leave something alone, asked if it came with free cloud storage. My mom choked into her napkin. My dad said Noah's name in a warning voice that was clearly fighting off a laugh of its own. But Maren didn't look at Noah. That detail mattered more than anything else that happened that night. Noah made jokes constantly about everything, and people usually just rolled their eyes at him. He'd once called my engagement ring a tiny surveillance device in front of the whole family, and nobody blinked. When I made a joke, even by accident, it apparently meant I'd done something to Maren specifically. Because she pushed her chair back hard enough to scrape the floor and told the table she'd known nobody would understand, that this was exactly why she and Ethan had waited so long to say anything. And then she looked straight at me and said I couldn't stand it when something wasn't about me. I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because I'd spent most of my life being asked to make things easier for everyone around Maren, and she walked out with Ethan trailing behind her, leaving his plate untouched, and we could hear my name through the wall more than once while they argued in the hallway. I found her a few minutes later sitting in Ethan's car in the driveway with the door still open, and I apologized, told her I'd been surprised and hadn't meant to embarrass her. It's a girl, that I should have just asked how to pronounce it instead of blurting out the first thing in my head. She wouldn't look at me. She said I always got to apologize after I humiliated her and everyone expected her to just accept it because I was the reasonable one. I told her I wasn't asking her to accept it right there in the driveway. She said good, because she didn't, and Ethan shut her door and drove her home. I stood there for a minute after the taillights disappeared, and underneath the embarrassment, I felt something I didn't want to admit to myself yet, which was relief. Not relief that I'd hurt her. I hated that. I was relieved because somebody had finally said out loud what I suspected her daughter might spend her whole life hearing in grocery stores and classrooms and job interviews. What is that? How do you spell that? Is that a brand name? I still believed, at that point, that there was some way to apologize for how I'd delivered the comment without pretending Annakinzel was actually a workable name for a child. I hadn't figured out yet that Maren didn't want an apology from me. She wanted a confession. Maren is 5 years older than me, and for most of our childhood she was the person everyone in every room watched first. She was beautiful in that dramatic, effortless way that made adults ask if she'd ever considered modeling. She sang the lead in every school musical she tried out for. She changed her hair color every couple of months and somehow made it look like a decision instead of a phase. When she landed a role in a local car dealership commercial at 16, my dad recorded it off the television and played it for anyone who set foot in our house for the next year. I was the younger sister who did fine in school, packed my own lunch, and never needed convincing that a B- was a personal attack from a teacher who had it out for me. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was easy, and for a long time I thought being easy meant my parents trusted me. It took me years to understand that being easy mostly meant people handed me the things they didn't want to carry themselves. If Maren forgot a costume for dress rehearsal, I was the one sent to bring it. If she was fighting with a friend, I was the one asked to text the friend and find out what happened. When she went through 3 breakups in a single school year, I sat on her bedroom floor each time and listened to a full explanation of how each boy had failed to understand her. There was always a pattern underneath whatever upset Maren, and the pattern was this: the worst thing in the world was never simply that something had gone wrong. The worst thing was that someone else had gotten something Maren believed had belonged to her first. When I got into the state university she'd always said she wanted to attend, she told everyone she'd actually always preferred her art program. And then 3 months later announced she was transferring there because she decided it fit her style of work better after all. When I got engaged before she did, she told my aunt at the engagement dinner that she and Ethan weren't the kind of couple who needed a ring to prove anything. And 2 weeks after that she posted a photo to the entire family of a promise ring Ethan had bought her after an argument, with a caption about choosing a deeper kind of commitment than a diamond could offer. None of it was ever dramatic enough on its own to complain about, which was exactly the problem. If I brought any single incident up, I sounded petty. My mom would say Maren was feeling sensitive. My dad would say she'd grow out of it eventually. Noah would say she was allergic to other people being happy and then get yelled at for being cruel. So the whole family quietly rearranged itself around her moods for years. We learned not to post good news in the group chat during a bad week of hers. We learned that when she was upset, the question was never whether she'd crossed a line. The question was always who had made her feel that way, and the answer was never supposed to be Maren herself. That night after the dinner, I texted her that I was sorry for embarrassing her and that I loved her and that I'd talk whenever she was ready. She never answered. The next afternoon, she sent a photo to the family group chat of a pale pink nursery wall with white shelves, a small rocking chair, and a wooden sign above the crib that read Clara, "It's a girl," with a caption saying that since some people had made it clear her first choice was a joke, she and Ethan had picked something safe enough for everyone else. My mom replied with 3 heart emojis calling Clara beautiful. My dad said he loved it. Noah, for once, sent nothing but a thumbs up. I stared at that photo for a long time. Part of me really was relieved because Clara was lovely, real, the kind of name a kid could grow into without ever needing to explain it to a substitute teacher. But the message didn't feel like peace to me. It felt like a bill being handed to me for something I hadn't ordered. I wrote back that Clara was beautiful and that I was still sorry I'd hurt her. She never reacted to it. She just let it sit there under everyone else's hearts. 2 days later, my mom called me on my lunch break and asked when I planned to make a real apology. I was standing in the break room at work holding a plastic fork over a sad container of pasta salad when she explained what she meant. Maren had spent the previous evening crying because I'd made her feel ashamed of being excited about her own daughter, and a private text wasn't enough after I'd embarrassed her in front of the entire family at dinner. What my mom actually wanted was for me to post in the group chat, in front of everyone, that I'd been jealous and harsh and that Annakinzel had really been a thoughtful, meaningful name all along. I told her I could apologize for making a bad joke, but I wasn't going to say I'd been jealous because it wasn't true. My mom sighed the sigh she used whenever she wanted me to feel like I was making something simple into something difficult, and asked why I couldn't just give my pregnant, emotional sister this one thing. I looked down at my lunch and asked myself, for the first time, what exactly I was being asked to give her. It wasn't a message and it wasn't a compliment. It was the right to decide what I'd meant, even after I'd already told her otherwise, and I understood right then that once I handed that over, she'd come back asking for something else. That evening, Noah showed up at my apartment with Thai food, and the look he gets whenever he's holding information he technically shouldn't have. He'd spent the afternoon helping my mom sort boxes in the basement, and one of the boxes had belonged to Maren, full of old yearbooks and photo albums and printouts from years ago, back when she and her college best friend, Tessa, had stopped speaking. I remembered Tessa. She used to be around constantly when Maren was 22 and I was 17, loud and funny, and the only person I ever saw tell Maren no without instantly apologizing for it. Then one day she was just gone, and when I asked what happened, Maren said Tessa had gotten jealous and weird after getting pregnant. Noah told me he'd found a stack of printed emails from that fight, and he hadn't read everything, but he'd read enough. Tessa had been pregnant with a girl, and had already picked out a first and middle name months before the baby was born, and she'd told Maren because they were best friends. Maren got pregnant unexpectedly a few weeks later with a boy, and according to the emails, she used Tessa's exact girl name as the brand name for a handmade baby clothes shop she was trying to launch online. And when Tessa asked her to stop, Maren told her she was being possessive over a word that belonged to nobody. Noah said it got worse than that. Maren had actually told Tessa to pick a different name for her own daughter, because Maren had already made the name public on Instagram for her Etsy shop, as if Tessa's unborn child was somehow copying a tote bag business. I sat down at my kitchen table when he told me that part. I remembered the baby clothes business, mostly because Maren had once made my mom and me model tote bags at a craft fair. But I hadn't remembered the brand name, and I definitely hadn't known it came from Tessa's daughter. Noah showed me 2 photos of the actual emails so I'd believe him. One was Tessa asking why Maren had used the exact name knowing what it meant to her. The other was Maren's reply, saying she couldn't believe Tessa wanted to punish her for a creative idea, that names didn't belong to anyone, and that Tessa was trying to turn her own pregnancy into a competition. It wasn't identical to Annakinzel, but the shape of it was the same shape I was living through right then. Maren could say a name belonged to nobody when she was the one taking it, and she could say a name was sacred and personal the moment she needed everyone else to protect it. And the actual rule underneath both positions was never about the name at all. The rule was whether Maren was winning. Noah said he was telling me because my mom had already started calling relatives to say I was refusing to apologize, and he'd overheard her on the phone with our Aunt Janice, and that my dad was staying out of it. Which mostly meant he was hoping the whole thing would burn out before he had to disagree with my mom out loud. When I asked why Noah hadn't just shown my mom the emails himself, he shrugged and said she'd only tell us both we'd done bad things and ask me to be the bigger person anyway, and he was so exactly right about that I felt tired before we'd even tried. For the next week, Maren didn't speak to me directly at all, but she posted constantly. Nursery photos first, then quotes about how people who love you protect your joy instead of making you doubt it. Then a long post about the loneliness of being a creative person inside a family that only valued safe choices. Nobody's name appeared in any of it. Nobody had to write mine. My mom commented on every single post, and so did 2 of Maren's high school friends and 3 cousins who hadn't spoken to me in months, writing things like she was going to be the most original mom they knew. And her baby was lucky to have someone who saw the world differently than everyone else. I stayed out of it as best I could. I'd already apologized. I'd already told my mom what I would and wouldn't say. I went to work, walked my dog, and watched television at night with my boyfriend Daniel, who was patient enough to let me explain the difference between apologizing for impact and confessing to a motive I didn't have. Sometimes 3 separate times in one evening. Daniel had only met Maren a handful of times, and because he's the kind of person who listens quietly before forming an opinion, Maren found him suspicious. And once told me she didn't trust anyone that calm because it meant they were secretly judging everyone in the room. The next real turn came at my Aunt Janice's 65th birthday brunch about 2 Sundays later. I almost skipped it entirely. My mom called twice that morning just to ask if I could please be pleasant, not kind, not apologetic, just pleasant. And the fact that she felt she had to specify that made it feel like walking into a meeting where everyone had already agreed I was the problem being managed. But Aunt Janice had driven me to my first job interview years ago, when my car broke down, and she'd called me the night of my engagement dinner, after Maren cried in the bathroom for half the party, just to tell me I deserved to enjoy happy things without managing anyone else's reaction to them. So Daniel and I went. Maren arrived 20 minutes late in a pale green dress, looking beautiful and also like she'd spent the entire drive rehearsing a speech. Ethan trailed her carrying a tote bag and a bakery box, and he gave me a small, exhausted nod when he saw me. For a while everything was fine. I asked Janice about her garden. Daniel talked baseball with my dad. Noah was strangely quiet, which I assumed meant my mom had threatened him in the car. Then Maren set the bakery box on the table and opened it to reveal sugar cookies shaped like tiny onesies, each one iced in pink with gold letters spelling out Annakinzel, missing the second A. And she watched me the entire time everyone else read the misspelled word. My mom said quickly that they were adorable. Maren smiled without it reaching her eyes, and said she and Ethan had decided they didn't want one ugly moment to make them give up on the name they loved, that Clara was a backup. And that Annakinzel was still her daughter's real name in her heart. The silence that followed was different from the dinner silence weeks earlier. That first time, everyone had just been surprised. This time, everyone in the room understood there was a trap hidden somewhere in it, and nobody could quite locate it yet. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, whether she decided on Clara after all. She said she decided she was tired of being punished for loving something original. My mom suggested this wasn't the day to reopen the conversation. Maren said she wasn't reopening anything, that I was the one who'd made it a conversation in the first place, and told me I only ever said things when I could later pretend they'd been accidents. That's when my 17-year-old cousin Ava, who'd been sitting across from me picking at her food and looking like she wanted to sink through her chair, started crying and asked, very quietly, if Maren could just not call the baby that. Maren turned on her and said, "What?" And Ava explained through tears that she knew it wasn't the same thing, that nobody had named a baby after the boy who'd bullied her specifically, but that she'd spent 2 years being called Princess Leia at school because of a Star Wars club joke that turned mean, with kids editing pictures of her and writing a fake fan fiction story about her that spread through the entire school, until she'd had to transfer schools midway through sophomore year. I hadn't known any of that. Her parents had told the family she needed a fresh start, and I'd assumed it was grades or anxiety, something private I shouldn't ask about. Ava said every time people joked about Star Wars names now, she felt 13 again, and she wasn't telling Maren what to name her own kid, she just didn't want to be expected to clap for it. Maren looked stunned for about 3 seconds, and then she told Ava she was sorry that happened to her. but that Ava couldn't make her unborn child responsible for what some teenager had done years ago. Ava's dad, my Uncle Rob, said gently that nobody was making the child responsible, that Ava was just telling Maren how it felt to hear it. Maren said what it felt like to her was that everyone in the family had decided her baby needed a boring name so the rest of them could feel comfortable, and when my mom said, too brightly, that Clara wasn't boring, Maren just looked at her and said, exactly. And that single word told me everything I'd needed to understand for weeks. This had never actually been about Annakin and Rapunzel. If it had, Maren could have defended it on its own terms, the sound of it, the characters, the fantasy of it. Instead, every single defense circled back to the same accusation, that other people wanted her to be ordinary. And in Maren's mind, ordinary had always ranked somewhere below cruel on the list of things she couldn't survive being called. Aunt Janice asked everyone to please stop. Iva left the room with her mom, and Ethan followed a minute later to check on her, because he seemed to be the only adult at that table who understood that a real person had just disclosed something painful, rather than scored a point in an argument. Maren sat stiffly with tears gathering in her eyes, and I hated the part of myself that still wanted to comfort her even then. It's a girl. She looked at the misspelled cookies and told me I'd gotten what I wanted, that now even her daughter's name was going to make people think about somebody else's trauma. It's a girl. I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything I could say that wouldn't become evidence against me later. I found Ava afterward sitting on the back porch swing with Daniel, who'd apparently gotten her laughing a little by describing some terrible science fiction show he'd loved as a teenager. I told her I was sorry nobody in the family had known what she'd gone through, and she said she didn't want a big deal made of it. She just wanted adults to stop telling her to be polite about things that made her uncomfortable. That sentence stayed with me for days, because it was exactly what every adult in my own family had been telling me about Maren for years. Be polite. Be patient. Let it go. She's emotional. She's going through something. Nobody had ever once asked why the person who felt uncomfortable had to be the one responsible for making everyone else feel better. The next morning, Maren sent me a private message with a photo of the misspelled cookies arranged in a neat row, and a caption saying she hoped I'd enjoyed watching Ava turn her daughter's name into a problem too. I sat with that message for a long time before I wrote back that I hadn't enjoyed any part of it, that I'd been wrong to joke at dinner, that Ava hadn't done anything wrong by telling the truth about her own life, and that I'd be happy to sit down with her and Ethan and help find a name that felt imaginative and personal and still usable for an actual child growing up in the real world. I fully expected her to reject that offer outright. Instead, she asked me to come to her apartment that Friday night alone, without Daniel or Noah, and without telling our mom. Daniel thought I shouldn't go by myself, and honestly, every conversation with Maren by that point felt like walking into a room where the furniture had been quietly rearranged in the dark. It's a girl, but she was my sister and she was pregnant, and some part of me still believed the whole thing could shrink back down to something manageable if we just talked honestly, so I went. When Maren opened her door, the first thing I saw on the entryway table was a stack of pink invitations reading, "A little adventure is on the way, celebrating Annakinzel Rose." The second thing I saw was Ethan standing at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the surface, completely still. Maren caught me looking at the invitations and said she told me Clara was only ever temporary, then smiled at me like she'd invited me over specifically to share good news. I asked why she'd bothered inviting me at all if she'd already made up her mind. She said she wanted me to hear it directly from her, before I told everyone she'd tricked me. And when I said I hadn't been planning to tell anyone anything, she said I always claimed that. And somehow people always ended up thinking she was the unreasonable one anyway. She led me into the living room where name books were spread across the coffee table, alongside printed lists from baby name websites, some names starred, others crossed out hard enough to tear through the paper. Clara appeared once, circled and then slashed through in red. Annakinzel appeared 12 separate times in different handwriting, with Annakin and Zell written underneath as nickname options, a small crown doodled beside Zell. I told her again that I was sorry for the joke at dinner, that I understood I'd made her feel stupid in front of people she loved, and that I got why it had hurt so much. She watched me the entire time without her face softening once, and when I finished she asked if I actually thought Annakinzel was a bad name. Not whether I understood why she loved it. Not whether we could move forward. A question with exactly one safe answer built into it. I thought seriously about lying to her, about buying myself another quiet month before the next blow-up. Then I pictured a little girl handing a substitute teacher a form for the first time, and Maren telling her that every confused look proved other people simply lacked imagination. And I told her I thought it was a lot for a child to carry. I kept going once I'd started, listing names that had a similar fantasy feeling but still gave a kid options growing up. Annalise, Ania, Arabella, Zolda. Celeste, I suggested Clara could keep something meaningful as a middle name instead. She said, "So you hate it?" And I said I didn't hate her, that those were two entirely different things, and she laughed with no humor in it and said that wasn't an answer. That's when Ethan walked in from the kitchen and stood behind the couch with his arms crossed tight enough that I could see his knuckles going pale, and told Maren that I was trying. She spun around and asked if she'd asked him, and he said no, but she'd invited me here and was now demanding I say the exact words she could later use against me. The room went completely still. Maren told him he'd promised to support her, and he rubbed a hand over his face, looking more exhausted than angry, and said he supported her having a name she loved, not turning that name into a test every single person had to pass. She stood up, and for a second I thought she'd start yelling, but her voice actually dropped very quiet instead, and she said we both wanted her to pick Clara because Clara was safe. The kind of name people chose when they had nothing interesting to say about themselves. Ethan said maybe a baby didn't need to be the most interesting thing about her, and I watched that land harder than anything else said that whole night. It's a girl, not because it was cruel, but because he'd put words to something she'd apparently spent years running away from. She left the room and shut the bedroom door hard enough to rattle a picture frame on the wall. Ethan sank into the armchair across from me and, after staring at the invitation stack for a while, told me things he clearly hadn't wanted to say. They'd started discussing names during the first trimester, and Clara had actually been on a list they'd both liked before they even knew the baby was a girl, until one of Maren's friends announced she was naming her new dog Clara, which Maren said ruined it instantly. They'd tried Analyze next, until a baby name account online called it cottagecore, and Maren decided her daughter wasn't going to sound like a trend. They'd tried Zelda until someone in Ethan's office joked about the video game, and Maren said she was tired of people missing the reference entirely. Finally, after a late-night movie marathon, she landed on Annakinzel, and Ethan had genuinely thought it was a joke at first, and when he realized it wasn't, he suggested it as a nickname or a middle name instead, which made Maren cry for hours and accuse him of wanting their daughter to disappear into a crowd. He told me he'd figured if he just let her have this one thing, she'd eventually calm down, but instead the name had slowly become everything: the cookies, the invitations, a wooden nursery sign she'd ordered and canceled twice over whether the letters should be gold or rainbow acrylic, and 3 full hours she'd once spent arguing with an online baby shop owner who'd simply asked how to spell the name correctly before starting the embroidery. He said she thought everyone was judging her, when sometimes people were genuinely just trying to do their job. It's a girl. I asked whether she'd talked to her doctor about how overwhelmed she seemed, and he said she had a prenatal appointment the following week, and when he'd asked to come with her, she told him she didn't need him speaking for her. I didn't offer him any advice, since I'd spent too many years watching Maren treat my advice as an insult, but I told him I was sorry he was carrying all of it alone. And he looked at me and said I didn't have to carry it either. That should have been the end of my involvement in the whole thing. It wasn't. 3 days later, my mom called me at 7 in the morning, which I already knew meant something was wrong, and told me Maren had posted screenshots of our private messages in the family group chat. I opened it before I was even fully awake. There it was, my apology after Aunt Janice's brunch, my line about helping her find something usable for a real child, my line about Annakinzel being a lot for a kid to carry, all highlighted in yellow, with Maren's caption on top saying she hadn't wanted to share it, but apparently needed the family to understand that I'd been trying to pressure her into changing her baby's name since the very beginning. My Aunt Denise had commented that she'd had no idea and that it was awful. My mom had written that everyone should take a breath. Noah had asked whether Maren wanted to include the parts where I'd apologized and offered to help instead of cropping them out entirely, and Maren had replied that everyone was just proving her point. There were 31 unread messages underneath that by the time I saw it. I told Daniel I needed an hour before I responded to anything. Every instinct told me to write something long and detailed defending myself, laying out the invitations and the cookies and everything Ethan had told me. Then I remembered Ava on the porch swing, saying she just wanted adults to stop telling her to be polite about things that made her uncomfortable, and I made coffee instead and opened a blank document on my laptop. I didn't write a speech, I wrote a timeline. At dinner, I made an inappropriate joke and apologized that same night. The next day, Maren announced Clara and implied I'd forced her into it. At the brunch, she served misspelled cookies and told the family Clara was temporary, and Ava disclosed why the Star Wars connection was painful for her, and I never once asked Maren to change anything. At the private meeting, Maren asked me directly for help choosing a name, and I apologized again and offered real alternatives, and she told me Clara was temporary and showed me finished invitations for Annakinzel Rose. That was the whole document, 4 dated entries and nothing else, no old grievances, no diagnosis, no paragraph about what Maren had always been like. I attached screenshots of the full conversations including my apologies, but nothing Ethan had told me privately, because that was his story and not mine to use. I sent it to my mom, my dad, Noah, Uncle Rob, and Aunt Janice, and nobody else, just the people who'd actually been there or gotten pulled into it secondhand. My message said I wasn't gonna argue in the group chat, that I was sorry for the joke and had already apologized for it directly, that I wouldn't say I'd been jealous or agree, that I was responsible for Maren's final decision, and that I was stepping back from all name discussions and wouldn't respond to any more screenshots. Then I muted the group. My mom called almost immediately and told me I'd made things worse by sending a timeline, that Maren was devastated, that I knew how vulnerable she was, and should have handled all of it privately. I told her I had handled it privately, and Maren was the one who'd shared part of a private conversation with the entire family. My mom said Maren was scared and hurt, and I said I knew that, but I was scared and hurt too, and nobody seemed to think that meant I got any say in what everyone else was allowed to repeat. There was a long pause, and then my mom said she didn't know what I wanted from her. For years that sentence would have folded me in half and sent me straight into fixing things for her. This time I told her I wanted her to stop asking me to fix Maren's feelings. She started crying, and I hated hearing it, but I didn't take the sentence back, and I told her I loved her and wasn't asking her to choose between her daughters, only to stop making me responsible for something I couldn't control. She said she'd try. It wasn't an apology, but it was more than I'd expected to get. For the next 2 weeks, the silence had its own kind of weather. Maren didn't text me, didn't post again about names, but didn't take the old posts down either. My dad came over one Sunday with a bag of groceries, which was as close to an emotional conversation as he'd ever managed, and told me he'd seen Maren at my mom's house filling out a hospital pre-registration form the day before. The form asked for the baby's name if known, and Maren had written Annakinzel, and when the receptionist on the phone asked her to spell it and then repeated it back wrong, Maren corrected her once, got it repeated wrong again, and started crying on the call. The receptionist, according to my dad, was perfectly kind about it and told Maren she could leave the field blank and decide later, but Maren hung up and locked herself in the bathroom for almost an hour. It's a girl. My dad said he'd wanted to tell her that people weren't against her just because they needed to know how to spell a word, and that a baby didn't need to win an argument. But he hadn't said it out loud because he was afraid she'd decide he was against her too. That was the first time in my whole life I'd heard him admit the problem wasn't always the person reacting to Maren. The baby shower landed the following Saturday. I got an invitation in the mail, even though I'd already seen the stack on her coffee table, and the name line that used to say Annakinzel Rose now just said Baby Rose. My mom asked if I'd come, and when I asked whether Maren actually wanted me there, my mom said it was up to me, which wasn't really an answer at all. Just a way of letting everyone pretend no decision had been made until I made the wrong one. I told her I wouldn't come, that I didn't want to make the day tense for Maren, and that I'd send a gift instead. Daniel and I mailed a soft yellow blanket, a board book, and a small silver bracelet with a tiny moon charm, nothing monogrammed and no name on the card. Just a note saying we were rooting for the little girl she was going to become. Maren never acknowledged it. Noah sent me one photo from the shower afterward, showing the gift table, my yellow blanket folded near the front, and behind it a large wooden letter C, leaning against the wall. 3 weeks after that, Maren went into labor early. My mom called me at 4 in the morning, shaky but not panicked, saying both Maren and the baby were fine and things were moving fast at the hospital. I sat awake in the dark for hours, running through every version of how this could go, whether Maren would post a hospital photo with Annakinzel written across the blanket, or name the baby Clara just to prove I'd broken her down, or say nothing at all. At 9:30 that morning, my mom sent a photo of a baby wrapped in a white hospital blanket, red-faced and furious with dark hair pressed flat against her head, Ethan holding her and looking wrecked and happy. Maren visible in the corner with her eyes closed and one hand resting on the baby's back. The caption read, Clara Rose. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Everyone is healthy. I read it 4 times and then cried in a way that surprised me, partly from relief, partly because a name should never have carried that much fear in the first place. An hour later, Maren sent me the same photo cropped closer, with a caption that just said she looked like Clara. I wrote back that she really did, and that I was glad they were both okay. Maren liked the message and didn't respond to it beyond that. I didn't visit the hospital since my mom said Maren only wanted Ethan and the baby around for the first day, and I believed that was probably true. 2 weeks later, my mom invited Daniel and me to Sunday dinner, mentioning that Maren and Ethan might come with the baby, though she didn't know for sure. I almost said no, then thought about Clara, who hadn't asked to arrive into a family that had spent months making her name carry everyone else's grown-up feelings, so we went. Maren and Ethan showed up after dinner had already started, Ethan carrying the car seat and Maren walking slowly behind him, pale and tired with her hair pulled into a loose knot. Looking less polished than I'd ever seen her and somehow younger for it. Less like the sister who always knew how to make a room look at her and more like a new mother who hadn't slept in days. Nobody mentioned Annakinzel once. My mom started crying the second she saw them. My dad claimed something was in his eye. Noah made one soft joke about being the baby's favorite uncle before my mom shot him a look, and everyone laughed a little, because that particular joke was safe to laugh at. Ethan handed me the car seat while he took off his jacket, mostly because I happened to be standing closest, and I looked down at Clara. Wide awake with dark, unfocused eyes, and one tiny hand escaped from the blanket near her cheek, and something in me settled all at once. She didn't know any of it. She didn't know about the screenshots or the misspelled cookies or the invitation stack, or that a group of adults had turned her entire future into a contest before she'd even taken her first breath. She was just Clara, warm and furious and completely alive. Maren came over after a minute and stood beside me looking down at her, and I told her she was beautiful, and Maren nodded, and then, without looking at me, said she still thought I'd been mean at dinner. The old version of me would have apologized instantly and agreed with her just to keep the door open a little longer. It's a girl. Instead, I told her I'd been thoughtless, and that I'd already apologized for that, and that I wasn't going to keep apologizing for having a different opinion about a name. And I wasn't going to keep fighting with her about it either. She went quiet, her eyes filling but not spilling over, and for a second I genuinely thought she might take Clara out of my arms and walk out. Then Clara made a small sound in her sleep, and Maren's whole face changed looking at her, and she just said, "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't an apology, but it also wasn't a new demand, and after everything, that felt like enough. Over the following months, Maren and I settled into something careful. We texted about Clara's first smile and the diaper size my mom accidentally bought too small. I sent gifts for every holiday. Maren sent a video the first time Clara rolled over. We didn't talk every day, and we never once talked about the dinner, the group chat, the cookies, or the invitations again. At Christmas, I noticed the wooden letter C from the baby shower hanging above Clara's crib, right next to photos of her wrapped in the yellow blanket Daniel and I had sent. Maren caught me looking and said simply that Clara liked that blanket, and I said I was glad, and that was the whole conversation. I don't know if Maren ever really understood why I stopped trying to fix every feeling she had. Maybe she thinks I got colder. Maybe she thinks one bad joke changed everything between us. The truth is the joke didn't change anything. It just showed me what had already been there the whole time. I could love my sister, and be sorry when I hurt her, and show up for her daughter, and mean it every time I said Clara was beautiful. What I couldn't keep doing was disappearing so that Maren never had to feel ordinary, and Clara, thankfully, never had to carry that job for either of us.